I was sort of parachuted in the last couple of days to fill this in, so my presentation is not really maybe joined up so much with the other presentations for today, but hopefully it will give you a bit of a background of Great Western Park, some of the constraints that we worked with, and possibly emphasise some of the items that Barry's already covered, in particularly this working in partnership, the framework plans and the way that the monitoring of the individual parcels as it goes through has been addressed. And it's perhaps some of the lessons that Great Western Park has pushed forward for other areas like Bicester, etc. Sorry. Gone completely. Ah, there we go. Right, I'm just going to go through a bit of the history of Great Western Park, just to give you in context the scale of it. Might cover a couple of things that Barry's already gone through. I'll also look at what was the original vision for it. You know, what was the ideas behind it, and the strategies that were put forward, and then really what happened on the ground, and the reality where it is now, and also to a degree go through some of the stuff that Barry's already mentioned. So for myself, just sort of give the history just in case you're wondering why somebody just comes in at the last minute can talk about the same kind of project. As was said earlier, I basically joined RSK back in the early 90s with Great Western Park as one of the schemes that I worked on, and I've seen it through from the early 90s through until 2012 when I left RSK, so I've got a bit of history behind it. In essence, being a consultant on the consultant side of the fence, sometimes we see ourselves as caught in this sort of gap between two opposing forces, as it were. One of them is the drive for legislation, the water quality, biodiversity, green infrastructure, flood risk, climate change, all of those sort of wider aspects. And then there's the other competing drivers of cost, land take, complexity, adoption, health and safety, all of those kind of stuff. So as a consultant, we're sort of caught in this middle bit, and this is really where we have to sort of work with everybody to get the balance right. So Great Western Park, hopefully the list is the same list that Barry had earlier. Yeah. Same number of schools, same number of houses, yeah? Just in case it's slightly different. Overall, it's 160 hectares, and 35 hectares, I think it's about right, is the open space provision. So unlike perhaps many smaller developments, there's a considerable area of green space on this site, which makes the perceived land take issues with SuDS a lot easier to perhaps handle on this scale of development. All the drawings, I'm afraid, have to be tilted because it's easier to read when it's north is up. But basically, yes, there are 3,300 new homes. I'm not sure where they're at the moment. They must be near 1,000 perhaps by now.
1,000 now.
Yeah. Built and perhaps most of those occupied. Yeah. Right, the planning stages that we had for Great Western Park were in 3 levels. We had the overall outline planning permission and application, which covered the entire concept of the development, with no real great detail in any of the aspects of it, although it did have a flood risk assessment and a drainage strategy that was agreed with the Environment Agency, Barry and several other parties. Part of that was that the site should be looked at, because of the length of duration that it was going to take to build, estimated about 11 years, that it was looked at in a series of framework areas, and roughly speaking it's north, central and south. And the phasing went along with that, so it basically developed from the north and it's gradually progressing south. I don't know if it's yet over the southern part of Wantage Road yet?
No.
So Wantage Road...
The main development is about here. They've commenced development here, so it's just this bit to fill in
yeah.
here.
Yeah, and nothing south of Wantage Road. So part of those frameworks, they had to be agreed as well with all the parties, which included local area briefs. So these were kind of detailed testing of various parts of the site, and they were generally the open space areas. There was the central playing fields was looked at. There was lots of areas to the north, informal and formal play areas that were looked at. The context of the primary schools, and these were looked at in these local area briefs, which were generally landscape driven, but needed the input from the drainage engineer and the designers, the highways, all those kind of aspects. And we'll kind of cover how that actually sort of performed towards the end. And then, of course, after all of those are agreed and in place, then there's a detailed planning of each of the individual parcels. On Great Western Park, there's at least 4 different developers. Taylor Wimpey are the majority developer, with about a 2/3 to a 1/3 share with David Wilson Homes. On the back of that, Persimmon have certain parcels dotted around all over the development, and the very southern sort of toe of the sort of shoe-shaped bit at the bottom there is Bloor Homes. So there's a lot of developers on there, a lot of competing sites, a lot of competing design standards that they like to incorporate. All had to be sort of wrapped into this design framework. So the consultant or the consultees that we got involved in at the start were really Oxfordshire County Council, Barry, and from the highways and from the drainage side of it. South Oxfordshire District Council, who had the majority of the land in their district. Vale of the White Horse had about a 1/3 of the site in their district, so there's 2 district councils that the site crossed the boundaries of. And of course the Environment Agency and Thames Water would probably be from, if we're concentrating on the water side of it and the SuDS side of it, those are the main consultees. To start with, because from what Barry said earlier about there was an emphasis on the floodplain related to the Thames and Oxford and various other watercourses areas. It was known quite early along when we did the concept designs, we were looking at the site, that there was the potential for a drainage flood risk in certain parts of the site. Now in the mapping at the time that we started the studies, back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, flood mapping started to kick in, and the area sort of just south of the railway line, marked on that plan there, is the very tip of our development. So that point is the only one really marked on any flood risk map, but we knew we had to deal with that one, as that was also identified as being the main access point onto the A4130, which is the main access at the top there. So that was an issue that was brought forward at the very beginning. Another part of the drainage flood risk, which is demonstrated on the right-hand smaller inset diagram, is that there's a couple of villages about a mile to the south of the site, which are downhill from the site, which also have a lot of flooding history, a lot of flooding incidents. There's a lot of issues with these little villages at the bottom. And all the way through the whole planning and the promotion of the site, there was a lot of an active sort of public team within those villages, headed up by some guys that used to work for the Environment Agency and various other and district councils, who were very conscious that any development uphill of where they lived had a potential to impact seriously their site, and they could see the site from their back gardens, as it were. So there was a physical risk identified in the flood maps, and there was also a perceived risk that any development uphill of where they lived had a potential to be detrimental to their nice little villages that they've got down the bottom there. So all of this was actually at the beginning of the development of the master plan, which I think was important on the Great Western Park, that this was flagged up at the beginning rather than after the master plan had been drawn up and somebody said, well, now get the SuDS to work. So this led to a series of data collection analysis that we went through, data gathering. And it produced a set of maps where we identified areas of surface water, groundwater, and fluvial flood risk. And this map, which was produced quite some time ago, is a composite of all the information that we got, not only from the Environment Agency and from the councils, but from the public as well. So quite a few of the blue blobs sort of identified on here were actually from records and photographic evidence that we had from the public. And as I say, these are the ex-Environment Agency people that happen to live quite locally. So, I mean, that was quite useful information, and as the developers got out on sites, and as some of these bits became quite apparent that the way the topography works, the way the site works, that these are, you know, real things that we need to consider. So, alongside the sort of looking at the surface water, groundwater was also an issue in this area, along with the geology. The site is split roughly. About 7/8 is on upper greensand, which is semi-porous, but has proved not to be as porous as theoretically it should be. And the upper sort of 1/7 is London clay, so, and hence not very porous at all. So what we also had to identify was how deep the groundwater was as well, because as Barry sort of hinted at, if you go back, the topography is that there's a ridge. I don't know if you can see the contours get quite dense towards the top there. There's basically a high point near the number 4 on that diagram, and then the whole site falls away from that point. So it falls very steeply towards the north and then very shallowly towards the south. And this topography reflects the difference between the upper greensand and the clay to the north. But also had an influence on where the groundwater was. So in the middle, the number 4 area, for instance, the groundwater is about 8 to 10 metres deep. But as you go to the very south bits, the bits that haven't been developed yet, the groundwater gets very close to ground level. So there's a lot of variation in groundwater, a lot of variation in permeability, and there's also the surrounding watercourses are not major watercourses. They're very minor ditches. There is only really one that actually has flowing water in it most of the time. Most of the rest are really field drains. And so this entire site, all 160 hectares of it, needs to be directed towards these watercourses. So the guidance that we had changed and developed as the scheme developed as well. So PPS 25 took over PPG 25 part of the way through the design process. The SuDS manual came out part of the way through the process. We also had the rainfall and the flooding events of 2007, which happened before the development kicked off, but while we were still working through the environmental impact assessment. We had the pit review that came out after that. So there's a lot of guidance going on at the same time that we were developing the strategy for Great Western Park. So we were kind of not running before we can walk thing, but it was ahead of the wave, I suppose you could say, is what we were trying to do. But we were following the Syria manual along with Paul and various others. I myself was on the steering committee for the first one. So we had that information in sort of back pocket, and as it was developing, we could bring it forward. And we were trying to get this concept driven in part to a great deal by Oxfordshire County Council to get that incorporated into the scheme. So we had to do, as many of you probably have done, some kind of SuDS selection, you know, which is best in which areas, to develop a strategy, to look at the options. And again, until we had the soil permeability tests, or even as we had the initial permeability tests, suggested that the green sand was more permeable than it ended up being later on, some of the choices, you know, had to remain quite vague. And also, and this is probably one of the important lessons from Great Western Park, which Barry's already touched on, is that we were involved in the conceptual design and the master planning side of it, the environmental impact assessment, getting the frameworks agreed, but not on the individual parcel design. And that, although we could give a whole list of suggested measures that could be taken, and a design criteria which was ultimately put in the framework plans as to what each parcel should aim to achieve, the continuity and bringing that together was a thing I think Great Western Park missed out on, in having that control and consistency across the parcels. So, as I say, the vision, which Barry touched on before as well, was really to look at a SuDS scheme. One thing Barry didn't mention was that one of the things that we were trying to do in this site was not to have any Thames water sewers. No sewers whatsoever for surface water. Because we had the water courses and the evergreen sand, there was the opportunity in this entire development not to have any Thames water involvement. It would have muddied the waters, as it were. It would have made it confusing as to whose drainage was whose if we'd have separated it out into the potential of having 3 different bodies involved. So we had this ability to merge the highways with the domestic drainage in a kind of template with what is aiming for the Flood and Water Management Act and what has been taken forward on other ones. What we also managed to do, and what was part of the vision, was that we should look at the green space and incorporate that with the SuDS. We should try and use the way the landscape works, the way the topography works, and merge it and use it consistently, rather than trying to compete, have the drainage compete with the landscaping, and the landscaping compete with ecology, and the ecology with public open space and various other things. We were trying to get all of that to be consistent and combined, and say to varying degrees of success. Just as a brief overview, these are sort of the concept plans that we had along some of the early stages of the development of the master plan. So the site, just give a little bit of a history, the original developer was George Wimpey, and that's how long ago it was. And they only really had options on the land to the north of Wantage Road, so not the whole area that's currently part of Great Western Park. So they were concentrating on that at a time when the local plan was being put together, and Bryant Homes, so it's everything north of that line, and Bryant Homes were looking at a totally alternative site on the north-east of Didcot, competing for the local plan. So there was a lot of scheme development on that kind of process in trying to allocate the land in the first place. At sort of about the same time that was determined, Taylor Wimpey was formed, which actually negated the conflict between the two parties as they became one. And then the scheme ultimately expanded to the south of Wantage Road. So there was lots and lots of iterations, lots of master plans that were done, and lots of going backwards and forwards. But the overall concept was kept, that we should be tackling in a sustainable way the drainage. So we were looking at what kind of features we could put in. And we knew that the top end had to manage the water, as it was the ultimate connection point to the drain and the existing watercourses. And to the south, there's about 3 or 4 very, very minor depressions in the ground, which you can only vaguely call a ditch. So we had to control the runoff into those areas. And you can just about see the top of East Hagmon, I think it is, at the bottom of the plan there. So that's the area that were very, very sensitive to what we were doing north of that. So we basically formed a template, a selection of the images of the things that we would like to include. So detention basins, infiltration basins, ponds, permeable paving was being promoted by Oxford to quite a large extent. To the south, or to the central area, very similar sort of structure. Less ponds in that particular area because of the way the topography worked. But we were working with the topography, with the ponds, rather than in some cases against. And we also had to deal with historic flows across Wantage Road from the north to the south, which there's a little corner just in here where historically all of the southeast corner of that north section, it flows to that corner and floods the houses on the corner at regular intervals. So that was another constraint that we knew was there, and any development would just aggravated it. So we have to build that into the scheme. And then in the southern area, because of the shallow groundwater and the shallow topography, the actual sort of detention basins, retention areas had to be a lot more expansive. But on this particular scheme, we had the public open space, the areas that we could use for that. So that was kind of the vision. So none of these pictures are actually the scheme itself. Those were the visions of what we were going to put in landscaping terms. And then we had some concept sketches of how the permeable paving might work, how the swale might work in and amongst urban areas, road crossings. And I think it was fairly on that we developed or agreed between the team that what's called an enhanced swale or an underground swale was probably the better option through the development, because it gave you that flexibility at outline stage to have a drainage system in that somebody could come along later on and put a driveway across or a road crossing. And at the time of the master plan, none of those were fixed points. So there had to be some kind of flexibility in the design so that somebody could change what they did at the surface without changing the drainage. So the under-drain swale seemed to be a sensible solution to that. So the constraints and the opportunities. So these are kind of really what we're talking about today, I suppose. We've got ground conditions. We had the clays and the upper green sands. The topography was challenging, very, very steep slopes, and then very shallow slopes. Groundwater levels, as I mentioned before, 8 metres to next to nothing. Infiltration rates, 10 to the -6 or 10 to the -7 or even less. We've got it in there. Land ownerships was key. When the project started, there were 29 different landowners, and each different landowner had a different payment mechanism for when the developers took hold of that bit of land. And it was all related to the number of units that were in that particular parcel, and some had better deals than others, and there was a lot of negotiation between. That had a significant effect on phasing, on the drainage and the legals, and what you could do within a particular parcel and what you couldn't do within a particular parcel. I say change of client. Taylor Wimpey went through lots of changes during the development of the scheme. Persimmon came on quite late on. Blore took over from another previous developer and then sort of went their way with part of the development. So there was actually changes that were brought into the master plan development which had nothing to do with drainage and were purely to do with sort of the client side of how it was going forward. And then in the middle of it, of course, 2010 kicked in, the whole scheme ground to a halt. So we had that to cope with as well, which meant that everybody could go back and have a little think and then come back and say, well, hang on a minute, is that really what we want to do now? So we had a delay, maybe 18 months, where there was very little work going on in the middle of it. Flood risk to the north, which was identified, flood risk to the south, which was perhaps more perceived or real. We also had problems with communication between the agencies. I mean, Barry alluded to the landscaping issue internally within Oxford, but we've also had issues in this site between the councils and the Environment Agency and various other bodies, where something that was perceived or thought to have been agreed at an earlier stage of planning is then contradicted later on when the detailed planning goes in. And this is particularly a case with the Environment Agency, as each individual planning applications went in, it seemed to be considered in isolation to the development as a whole. And that happened on quite a regular basis more recently. And also legal frameworks, how are things going to be adopted, what's going to be adopted. I mean, I remember one of our tasks was identifying the legal boundaries between what was Section 38 highways, what was Section 38 SuDS, what was non-Section 38 SuDS, what was public open space, what was informal public open space, what was district council, and how you demarcate all of those things on a bit of open ground. That was an issue. But on the plus side, the idea of the early involvement of the drainage shaped and helped shape the master plan. We weren't really having to face that additional challenge of coming in after somebody had said, well, this is what it's going to look like, sort the drainage out. We had that chance to work with it, and that really benefited the scheme because we could work with the landscapers in particular to introduce green fingers that weren't going against the topography, that were working with it. The overland flood flow routes, although they may not look pretty, at least they're in the right place. The prettiness bit is something else. Is something else. But we had that opportunity to work with the whole team to get that joined up thinking, to get it to perform on a whole range of levels. The three-stage planning did help in creating these frameworks, particularly on a big site. On a small site, it may not be necessary, but when there's a lot of people involved. And probably the last one is the one that's the framework for what is intended with the SAB. And what was very useful in that, everything involving surface water on Great Western Park was dealt with the same people. Although the Environment Agency were a little bit to one side of it, at least the surface water was being controlled by one team, as it were. I've just got a few, I know I've got a couple of minutes. I'm just going to run through a few slides of what it actually looks like. Maybe not the same slides that Barry had. But in essence, this was an aerial picture from early in 2011 showing the development. It's basically looking south, so up the other way from the other plans. So it's got the main spine road, the roundabout, and the development platforms. You can actually see the outlines of some of the ponds being formed towards the south end.
The road has now been pushed right down to the wanted road. Development is down to here.
I mean, you can possibly see the landowner bits as well as the different fields are in there. So that's kind of what it looked like then. This is kind of the planning diagrams that went along at the stages when we're looking at detailed phasing of how each phase would work, where the green infrastructure gets built into each of the phases. This is one of the more refined versions of the underdrain swale detail with the curb. We can go into that debate at some other issue, but in essence, there is a drain underneath that swale going down there, and it's only a 300 diameter pipe, both sides of the road, taking, in a sense, about 1,200 units. So the drainage from 1,200 units through a 300 diameter pipe. Permeable paving. Now, this is where I have to sort of step back from the master planning side of it to the detailed side of it. Although it was the significant option within the parcels, our team was not involved in the detailing of it. And there were, from last count, about 3 or 4 separate consultants working on different parcels at the same time, all looking at the permeable paving in a different way. Marshals were looking at some of the sections, some of the areas, and there was a few other consultants, and they all tackled it differently. So the top left-hand image is the one where the paving in the top right-hand of that image is the permeable section, and in the left-hand side it's the non-permeable section with the services in it and the drainage, which is fine. The image centrally at the bottom is the same thing, but with the permeable on the left-hand side. The permeable on the right-hand side and the non-permeable on the left-hand side, but somebody's put the drainage in the right-hand side. So I don't take any responsibility for that.
No, but it goes to say, again, you've got a figure in space there, it means simpler for the over edge, which is fine.
Yeah.
But that was outside of your remit and my remit.
Yeah, all within the site. I mean, that manhole, to be fair, is probably the foul drainage.
Yes.
But equally, it could have been positioned somewhere a bit better than there. In essence, because of the poor permeability, although we have permeable paving all over the site, these aren't necessarily Great Western Park specific ones, but the concept was that it's generally a type B type of permeable paving where you allow some infiltration, but if it's not working, then you have to have another route out. And it's the same in Bicester and various other developments with the permeable paving. So really, in summary, we had a vision. It went through the planning stage, and then it was onto the design. And it's the construction and the reality of it are the things that are probably the least favourable aspects of how it's happened. It's We didn't have at Great Western Park what Barry mentioned that he's got in Bicester, which is there isn't an overarching reviewer of the parcel designs. Each parcel design gets done by each consultant team, each developer, and then submitted as part of the planning, agreed with Oxfordshire, but there's no consistency. There's nobody joining them up, making them the same, employing the same design standards. If a new consultant comes on for a different parcel, they may have a completely different idea of how to do it, and then that part of the site will look slightly different from the other ones before. And the detailing and the finishing and the workmanship are issues that were highlighted by Great Western Park. The thing with the outfalls, it's very, very easy to buy 150 precast concrete formed manhole outlets off the shelf and then just get the ground worker to put the same thing in everywhere. But it doesn't make it look nice, but it's very, very cheap.
Yes.
So, and I think in essence that's pretty much what happened, in that all of the outfalls are probably all identical, aren't they? Yeah. Lessons, communication between the various parties. The Environment Agency could have been a lot more helpful if they had a consistent team. It would have made the transition of getting the various approvals a lot easier. Drainage as part of the master plan and not as an afterthought or crammed in at the end is key. Using the ground conditions or at least being aware of what the ground conditions are. Use the topography. Don't put the ponds at the top of hills. I still see master plans come on my desk with ponds at the top of hills. Establishing who and what adopts what areas right on at the start. I mean, we had a lot of dialogue with Oxfordshire on this one because it was a new concept to us. We needed to understand what Oxfordshire were after in terms of adoption. But I would say that at the moment we are in that position now where we also have this dilemma about who adopts what, in what situation, in what combination of situations, for what site, where is your site in the planning? Is it in? Is it about to go in? And then who adopts what? So always good to identify that at an early stage. And, to be fair on the different consultants and that, there are different ways of doing different things. And if you've got a lot of teams working on the same problem, you'll come up with a lot of different answers. But workmanship and the experience of the ground workers as well, because SuDS is still new to some and still perceived sometimes as just being a crate under a car park. The workmanship and the experience of the teams constructing it are important. And at the master plan stage, it's being very flexible with what is put forward and what can be achieved, and balancing those things again. And communication again, just because that's probably the most important part of it. I think just if you needed any more information, there's actually a Great Western Park website, which was established by Taylor Wimpey and various others. That's still up and running, which has got some details on it. There's also a case study been done by Interpave on Great Western Park, which has got a lot of more up-to-date pictures than I've got. It does concentrate on the permeable paving side of it, but then there is a lot of permeable paving, but it does cover the master plan issues. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.